Today I'm taking one stamp and showing you 10 completely different ways to use it. 10 mediums, 10 looks, all from a single design. It's such a fun way to see how versatile stamping can be. The stamp I'm using is from my nature collection, and we're starting off with watercolor. If you've never used watercolor before, it's a very fluid medium that comes in a few different forms, usually in a tube or dry in a half pan. Up at the top, I wanted to show how the medium looks on its own without using a stamp. So on the left side, I use it at the full strength, and on the right, I add some water to blend it out. Watercolor is unique because you can always drop in extra colors while it's still wet. It's very free-flowing, but still offers a lot of control. There are a few ways to apply it to a stamp. My favorite is to wet your watercolor pan with a damp brush, and then you'll use that brush to apply the color directly to the stamp. You'll notice that the paint starts to bead up a little on the surface. That's totally normal. If your stamp has larger, flat areas, that will actually create a really beautiful effect. When you're ready to stamp, press down very lightly to transfer the image. Watercolor is water soluble, which means you can rework it after it's dry. The opacity varies depending on the pigment, but overall watercolors are transparent and have no texture on paper since they are absorbed into the surface. They're perfect for lighter layers and for a loose, painterly look. Watercolor gives you those soft, flowing blends and transparent layers, which are perfect for a loose, painterly look. Next, let's try liquid watercolor. These usually come in a small jar with a pipette or dropper top. As you can see, this medium is very fluid. You don't need to add much water, if any at all. You can even use it straight from the bottle if you want a very intense color. This brand in particular is dye-based, which means that it's highly saturated and bright, but it can fade over time. So it's great for working inside of a journal or for scanning, but not really ideal for long-term display. Because liquid watercolor is so fluid, your stamp transfer will look a little looser and less predictable. That can be a good thing if you want a more organic or natural look. The color beads up on the stamp in a really interesting way, giving a lot of variation in tone. Like regular watercolor, liquid watercolor is water soluble and transparent, with no noticeable texture once dry. Liquid watercolor is super fluid and vibrant, giving you unpredictable organic results with bright, saturated color. Next up are watercolor markers, and the results here might surprise you. These are great because they allow for very precise application, but when you follow with a wet brush, they blend out beautifully, just like a traditional watercolor. To apply the markers to a stamp, simply color directly onto your stamp with the marker for even coverage. You can also add multiple colors to different areas. For example, adding a little bit of yellow to one part of the leaf. The precision of the marker tip combined with less fluidity makes it easy to control where the colors can go. So once stamped, you're going to get a really nice clean transfer, but you can also go back in with a wet brush to soften or blend out areas. Watercolor markers are water-soluble, transparent, and absorb very nicely into paper. Watercolor markers let you be precise, but still get that beautiful watercolor look once you blend them with water. It's really the best of both worlds. Now for our only dry medium today, the watercolor pencil. These work very similarly to the watercolor markers. You can apply the pigment precisely, then just use a wet brush to blend it out for that watercolor effect. So you can kind of gauge how dry or how wet you want these to look. This is a very unconventional medium for stamping, but I think that you end up with pretty cool results. Here's how I like to use them. Lightly mist your stamp with water, then draw directly on top of it with the watercolor pencil. That little bit of moisture helps the pigment transfer properly, and it will not work if the stamp is dry. This technique is going to create a very soft and subtle transfer. So if you want it to have more of that watercolor pencil kind of look, you can go back through with a pencil and refine some of the edges to put some of that dry medium back on your page. These are also going to be water soluble, so you can work back into them after they're dry, and they're going to be semi-transparent. so some colors will cover a little bit more than others. These have minimal texture depending on how much dry pigment you add to the surface. Watercolor pencils offer control and softness. You can draw directly on the stamp for that subtle hand-drawn feel, or on the paper for a more rigid look. Next, let's move on to gouache. The main difference between gouache and watercolor is that gouache is opaque, while watercolor is typically transparent. Gouache has added white pigment or chalk, giving it a flat, matte finish, and the ability to color layers underneath. You apply it just like a watercolor, where you'll use extra water to tone down the saturation and move that paint around. You'll notice that on the stamp that the gouache does not bleed up in the same way as watercolor. Depending on the brand, the gouache may even feel a little bit stickier. And since it normally comes from a tube instead of a drying pan, it's thicker, less fluid, and if your first transfer with a stamp is looking a little bit dry, just add another coat and stamp again. This is going to be because of the lack of fluidity within the gouache. The registration press tool can be really helpful here for that perfect alignment. Gouache is also a water-soluble medium, and the opacity can vary by color, but generally it's semi-opaque to opaque, and it's going to have minimal texture. Avoid building gouache up too thickly as it can crack if it's over-applied. Gouache is bold and opaque, great for flat, matte layers that stand out and cover anything underneath. Next one I'm sure you're already familiar with, but let's try out an ink pad, one of the most common stamping supplies. I wanted to swatch this one up at the top to show how the ink sits on the paper compared to the other mediums that we've used. You'll see that the ink pads give a slower, more controlled buildup of soft color. They're not at all like the watercolors. Application on paper and stamp is going to be pretty similar. All you're going to do is simply blot or rub the ink pad directly onto the surface. Ink pads work beautifully with stamps if you are using an intricate stamp or a stamp that has a lot of negative shapes within it. They definitely are detail-oriented and great for that slow control build. Depending on the brand, ink pads are usually water-soluble, transparent, and texture-free once dry. Ink pads give you crisp, controlled impressions, classic, simple, and reliable for clean stamping. Next we have liquid ink. This one's less fluid than watercolor, so the colors don't flow as freely into each other. You'll have a little bit more control of where you push your color. Some liquid inks even have self-leveling properties, which help you get smooth, even transfers. You can apply the ink with a brush, brayer, or blending tool. I prefer the blending tool with a sponge head adapter for a very even coat. All you need to do is add some ink to a palette or mat so that you can control how much product you're using. A little bit goes a long way. Apply this with really light pressure, as pressing too hard can blur out those fine details. Liquid ink creates smooth, even transfers with a bit more richness and depth, and it's perfect for detail work. This particular ink is waterproof, so you can work into it with water while it's wet, but once it's dry, it's going to be permanent. So I'm going to mark it down as WP for waterproof. It's generally semi-opaque with smooth, texture-free finish. Next is acrylic ink, which is basically a very fluid form of acrylic paint, and will seem very similar to using a liquid ink in a few ways. I believe that this one is the most user-friendly. This is my favorite medium for stamping, as it's excellent for layering and can be used in full concentrate for those bold edges, or scaled back to a messier transfer by just simply adding water. It behaves similarly to liquid ink, so I like to use the blending tool for it as well, and that way I can control where the color builds up. Start with less and layer more if needed. Acrylic ink is buildable and waterproof, making it great for layering. Once it's dry, it stays put. Acrylic ink is waterproof when dry, and usually opaque depending on color and brand, so it's perfect for those upper layers. It dries smoothly and there's almost no texture at all. Now for acrylic paint. This medium has more body than acrylic ink. It's thicker, less fluid, and gives a bit of a 3D look. If you use the paint without water, it will be thick, but adding water will thin it out, changing the viscosity and transparency. Using acrylic paint gives your stamp transfers some texture, which you can thin out with a little water before application if you prefer a smoother result, more similar to the acrylic ink. You can apply the acrylic paint to the stamp using a brush, a brayer, palette knife, or a blending sponge. It's very versatile in application. I like to aim for a slightly spongy, spotted texture on the stamped surface. That usually gives me clean transfer results on the first try. Acrylic paint is water soluble and very workable when it's wet, but once it's dry, it's going to be completely waterproof. It's typically opaque, and it adds a medium amount of texture, making it ideal for top layers. Keep in mind that depending on the color, you may get a different transparency, and depending on the brand, you may get a different thickness. And last but certainly not least, we have modeling paste. This is an acrylic medium that you can mix in with acrylic paint to give it extra body and texture. If you want a bold dimensional transfer, then modeling paste is perfect for you. Simply use a palette knife to mix it in with your paint. The more paste that you add, the thicker the paint will get. Just note that it can slightly lighten your paint color. You can apply it however you prefer, but the blending sponge tool works really great for that even coverage. The only drawback to the modeling paste is that it can blur very fine stamp details, so it's best for bold, simple designs. Modeling paste is all about texture. It adds thickness and a 3D effect that makes your stamped designs really stand out. Modeling paste is workable while wet, but waterproof and permanent once dry. It's going to be very opaque and has a very heavy texture, so this is perfect for your final layers. The modeling paste will dry with this 3D effect, so if you like texture on your art journals and cards, then this is for you. That wraps up our look at 10 ways to use one stamp with different mediums. Every product brings its own texture and feel, and there's no right or wrong. Just use what you enjoy most. I hope this gave you some inspiration to explore and create something uniquely yours. Thanks so much for joining me, and happy creating!